All right, guys, welcome to chapter 13 through 18 summary with going after Cacciato. We're going to be looking at key points and talking about a couple of pieces of symbolism in these chapters. Let's get started. Chapter 13, falling through a hole on the road to Paris. So first things first, we know that this is a fictional chapter because it's one of the Paris chapters. This is when they've walked down the road and they find the map that says, look out, there's a hole in the road, and then Paul Berlin is desperate to keep Sarkin around, and so he makes a hole appear. They all fall into it, third squad and everybody else. Conveniently, somewhat fantastically, the ants and the ox cart both disappear during the fall. They fall into the hole, but if you look, you'll notice they don't land at the bottom. Just third squad and Sarkin, which is very convenient because now our narrator has his love interest with him. So that was handy. Sarkin's now with them. In the hole, they meet a man named Lee Van Hock, and he introduces himself as a major in the 48th Viet Cong Battalion. This is really interesting because the Viet Cong were not formally organized. They were a guerrilla force. They were townspeople and farmers, and they did not have a structure in the army like the U.S. Army. Now, when we think about the fact that this is Paul's dream, Paul's fantasy, this makes a little bit more sense because Paul doesn't know anything about the Viet Cong. We know he doesn't know anything about Vietnam, certainly not the Viet Cong. And so it makes sense that he's going to create a character with the ideas he already has, which is that he would be a major or something like that in an organized army. Lee Van Hock then proceeds to answer a lot of their questions, and these are all questions that Paul would have loved to have known. We know Paul is very confused about the war. He doesn't like the war. He wishes he knew more about it. And in the course of talking, Lee tells him that the land is your true enemy, that the people are just an extension of the land. And he refers to it as this idea of Za, and he says that the Za, the land, is your true enemy. This is a really interesting idea because what's causing them so much controversy in the squad is the searching of the tunnels. So in a way, the land really is their true enemy. It's the thing they're trying to defeat. Now clearly, it's really difficult to defeat the land because it's fairly ubiquitous. It's all over the place. And so by saying the land is your true enemy, really suggests internally to Paul that they're not going to win this war, that it's unwinnable. If you're trying to fight the land, it is just not something that's going to work out well for you. This is made more interesting when, as the night wears on, Paul and Lee Van Hock are walking around, and Lee Van Hock invites Berlin to look through his periscope, and he sees chapter 14, upon almost winning the Silver Star. Berlin sees the deaths of Frenchie Tucker and Bernie Lynn from a different perspective. So he's imagining what it would look like from a different perspective. Now, this chapter is interesting just for a couple of reasons. One, the title, upon almost winning the Silver Star. We know the Silver Star is for bravery, which means that this must be a chapter where Paul is brave, and just maybe not brave enough, or is almost brave. But we actually know that when it came time for someone to rescue Frenchie Tucker, that Berlin is careful not to look at anyone, and he stands against the wall and tries not to be seen, and doesn't step up and volunteer. Bernie Lynn eventually does volunteer. He does exhibit bravery, and we know how that ends. So the lesson Paul comes away with in chapter 14 is that bravery gets you killed. Bernie Lynn is brave. He volunteers. He goes into the tunnel, and he gets shot less than a minute after being in the tunnel. So this message is really kind of a scary one, which is you can be brave, but there's a very good chance that your bravery will end up getting you killed. And we know that Paul Berlin has the goal of living long enough to establish goals worth living for. He has no intention of dying in this war. Chapter 15, tunneling towards Paris. We know that it's a fictional chapter because it's about Paris. Chapter 15 takes us back into the tunnels after that side trip to chapter 14, and Lee Van Hock tells Paul that things may be viewed from many angles. This is, again, it relates back to Paul's story because he's thinking about a different way that things could have turned out. And so this idea of different angles is interesting because it supports our idea that Paul is trying to make things up. What's interesting is this is one of the times we see Paul's story again hit another snag, because even in his lie, he needs there to be some logic in it. And so his VC informant, Lee Van Hock, takes him captive because he's Viet Cong. And so then the tables have to be turned. Fortunately, the Americans have guns, and Lee Van Hock has no guns. But then they hear his story, Lee Van Hock's story, and he tells them how he's actually trapped in this maze, which, if we remember, all of this is not happening. And so the maze really kind of symbolizes Paul's own subconsciousness. And Lee Van Hock and Paul himself are really kind of trapped in their own thoughts, in their own fears, all of these things. Lee Van Hock kind of represents that aspect of Paul. Of course, in chapter 15, it is Sarkin who saves them. Paul needed to find a way for her to save them. She knows the land. They get trapped in the land, and Sarkin then saves them. Sarkin tells them that to go home, one must become a refugee, and that's how you defeat the land. And this is a paradox, because if you're a refugee, you don't have a home. So how can you find your home if you're a refugee? And it's this interesting idea of if your home is nowhere, then anywhere can be your home. And that's really kind of what they're suggesting in this chapter. This is the chapter where we kind of see the reason why Paul wanted Sarkin around and how he kind of makes an excuse for her to be around and be useful to them. Chapter 16 is pickup games. Chapter 16 is back into the real war now. It is them going through the jungle and accomplishing things. There's a regularity to the war that Paul Berlin says he likes. There's a pattern to it. It says that they're bombed on certain days and shelled on other days, and that it really is kind of nice to know when certain things are going to happen. They start playing basketball. It's very interesting. Basketball is a very American sport. There are two teams. There are plans and plays. And it says that Paul Berlin liked the clarity of it. It's very easy to have a winner and a loser and to make a plan and to execute that plan. That's the kind of war that Paul likes. Not at all like the war that's going on in Vietnam. This is where we start to see Third Squad really disliking Sidney Martin. It says he was too clear-headed for such a lousy war. He makes them search the tunnels. That's what this has always been about. He's making them fight the land. And we know that Paul's subconscious feels like fighting the land is a horrible idea. It's an idea that will end in nothing but failure. This is when Oscar starts to talk about Lieutenant Sidney Martin, about the idea of maybe fragging him. He has this whole conversation about the man's asking for trouble. He says it while he's holding the grenade. The chapter ends with Rudy Chassler stepping on a mine. And this is where another battle begins. I believe that this is the battle that then ends all the way up in chapter 41 with Buff's death. I think that is the battle that begins in chapter 16, where they fight their way through these villages at this kind of surprise attack that happens to them. Chapter 17, a light at the end of the tunnel to Paris. Once again, we're in Paris chapter, so it's fictional. Not much to say about this chapter. Sarkin leads them through the tunnels all the way to Mandalay, which is a city outside of Vietnam. Paul and Sarkin's relationship, as it were, making the air quotes, but you can't see those, relationship continues. And we get another one of those phrases where Paul believed what he saw. We can interpret that as Paul is creating his reality. He is believing it into existence. Chapter 17 is a really kind of calm chapter. Third Squad has calmed down. The story really kind of starts to drag a little bit, and it's almost as though Paul is not quite sure how to keep it moving forward. They've escaped Vietnam. They know they're supposed to be going after Cacciato, but they're not quite sure what's going to happen, how they're going to keep it moving forward. Fortunately, chapter 18, Prayers on the Road to Paris, solve that. Third Squad begins their search in chapter 18. They're looking for Cacciato in Mandalay. I'm going to put quotes around searching because they're not really searching for him. They're drinking and walking around and having a good time. Berlin sees Cacciato dressed as a monk. This is a very interesting choice, or very symbolic choice, I should say, because monks are peaceful. Monks are nonviolent. The fact that this AWOL officer dresses up as a monk suggests, again, how Paul is kind of seeing things, that he sees Cacciato as a peaceful character, as a calm character, as a nonviolent character. And we really do get that with Cacciato as well. He runs after Cacciato into the monks and very, very uncharacteristically gets attacked and beaten up and knocked unconscious, actually, by the monks. And when he comes to, we have this very surreal scene where Sarkin is licking his wounds. Now, we know Sarkin's not a real girl. If we didn't, this should have been a big clue. But this is, licking your wounds is a metaphor. What makes this so interesting is this is kind of further proof that Berlin has really never had a girlfriend. He really is just a young kid who kind of gets carried away and doesn't know how to really describe things, and has probably heard the phrase licking his wounds before, but just like with his father, like, he takes it too far. He takes it literally. Just like when his father told him to look for the good, and he took it literally to create the good, Sarkin licking his wounds, he takes a metaphor and just pushes it too far. Now, this chapter ends with Cacciato jumping on a train going to Paris. This gets the story moving again, so this is good. Now, what's more interesting to think about is how the story is progressing. That we've gone from walking to an ox cart, so we've increased speed there. An animal is going to pull you faster than you can walk. And then we go from an ox cart to a train, and eventually we'll see where the train goes. So as the story, as the narrative progresses, it also picks up speed. His story is starting to get away from him. It's starting to develop a momentum. The characters are starting to act. Things are starting to happen. This lie is starting to kind of take on a life of its own. And now he just gets to go along for the ride and kind of push it going forward. It's interesting to think about, but if you think about it, if you tell a lie long enough, eventually you start to believe it. And this is what's happening now as Paul gets deeper and deeper into this story. This brings us to the end of chapter 18, where we have Third Squad on the train heading to Paris. When you come back from spring break, you will have read chapters 19 through 30. That will be a longer flipped classroom lecture. I may split it into two. It depends on how long it is, but expect that you will have a longer one as we go over those very important chapters. Please don't forget to take the quiz after listening to this lecture, and have a good night.